I want you to understand what kind of woman my wife is before I tell you what her daughter-in-law expected her to do. She's the kind of woman who drives 40 minutes in February to drop off soup when a neighbor's sick. The kind who remembers birthdays without Facebook, who sends cards by actual mail, with a stamp and a handwritten note inside. She spent 31 years as a school librarian in Sudbury, and half the kids who came through that building still message her on holidays. Not because they have to, because she made them feel like they mattered. Her name is Lorraine. She's 62 years old. She has a laugh that fills a room and a patience I have spent 28 years trying to borrow. She has never once, in all the years I've known her, asked anyone to do something for her that she wouldn't do herself twice over. I'm telling you this because what happened last Thanksgiving needs context. And the context starts with who she is, not with what was done to her. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. My name is James. I'm 54 years old. I retired early from a logistics company in Sudbury 2 years ago, and Lorraine and I had just started doing the things we'd been putting off for 30 years. Weekend drives up to Killarney, longer visits to her sister in Halifax, a trip to Tofino we'd been talking about since 2009 that we finally took in September. We have one son. His name is Kyle. He's 31, works in commercial real estate in Toronto, and married a woman named Tessa 4 years ago. Tessa is sharp, organized, and has what I'd describe as a very clear picture of how things should be, and a fairly limited tolerance for how things actually are. I want to be fair to Tessa. She's not a bad person, she's driven. She comes from a family where things were done a certain way, and I think she assumed our family would simply fold into that shape. For the first couple of years, we did. Lorraine, especially. She'd drive down to Toronto for Christmas even when we'd hosted for 15 years straight. She'd bring food, she'd help clean up, she'd smile and say it was no trouble when Tessa made comments about her cooking being a bit heavy, or her baking being not really what Kyle eats anymore. I watched it happen slowly. The way Lorraine would go quiet in the car on the way home, the way she'd stare out the window and say, "I'm fine," in a tone that meant anything but, "I should have said something sooner. That's on me." The first sign that something had shifted came in August, 2 months before Thanksgiving. Tessa sent Lorraine a message saying they were thinking of hosting Thanksgiving this year at their condo in Toronto, and that they were hoping to have about 22 people. Lorraine read it to me at the kitchen table and said, "Oh, that'll be lovely. Should we offer to bring something?" I said sure. A pie maybe. Or the cranberry sauce. Tessa replied 3 days later. Her message was longer than I expected. She said she'd been planning the menu and was hoping Lorraine could take on the cooking side of things, since she and Kyle would be focused on hosting and making sure everyone was comfortable. She said she wanted a real traditional spread: turkey with stuffing, roasted potatoes, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green bean casserole, honey glazed carrots, homemade gravy, cranberry sauce from scratch, 2 kinds of pie, dinner rolls, and a charcuterie board for when guests arrived. 11 items. She also noted that since the grocery stores get crazy the week of, it would be easiest if Lorraine could do the shopping ahead of time and bring everything down in coolers to Toronto, a 4.5-hour drive. And she'd need to arrive Saturday, 2 days before Thanksgiving, to get a head start. I read that message 4 times. I kept thinking I was missing something, a just kidding at the end, a question mark somewhere, something that signaled this was a suggestion and not an assumption. There was nothing. Lorraine sat across from me with her hands wrapped around her mug. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I suppose I could do most of it." And I said, "Lorraine." And she looked at me, and I said, "You don't have to do this." She got quiet the way she does when she's thinking something through. She said, "It's just one Thanksgiving. I didn't push. I should have. But I know my wife, and when she's made up her mind to give someone grace, there's no talking her out of it before she's ready." She replied to Tessa and said she'd see what she could do. Tessa replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was it. That was the entire response. I want to pause here because I know some of you are already asking the same thing the comments will ask. Why didn't we just say no? It's 2 letters. It's 1 word. The honest answer is that Lorraine loves her son. She has loved Kyle since the moment he existed, and she has spent 31 years making sacrifices she never once called sacrifices. Saying no to something that involved Kyle, even indirectly, felt to her like drawing a line that might cost her something she wasn't willing to lose. I understood that, I also understood that something was starting to shift in me that I hadn't fully named yet. September came and went. Lorraine started making lists. She pulled out her big roasting pan and oiled the hinges on the coolers, and looked up driving times from Sudbury to Toronto, accounting for the Thanksgiving weekend traffic on the 400. She didn't complain. She never complains. That's the thing about Lorraine. She just absorbs it and adjusts and keeps moving. Which is exactly why people keep adding weight. It was a Tuesday night in early October when things changed. I'd come in from the garage, and Lorraine was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. And she looked, I don't know how to describe it exactly, still. Not peaceful still. More like the kind of still that comes right before someone says something they've been holding for a long time. I sat down across from her. She turned the laptop toward me. Tessa had sent another email. This one had a subject line. Thanksgiving details. Please read carefully. It was long. I'm going to tell you what was in it. Tessa had updated the guest list to 26 people. She had added 2 of Kyle's colleagues and their partners because it came up naturally and it would have been awkward to uninvite them. She noted that 1 guest was lactose intolerant and 2 were gluten sensitive, and she'd appreciate it if Lorraine could keep that in mind when preparing dishes. She said the dinner would be at 5, but since the condo was on the smaller side, she needed everything ready before guests arrived at 4 so the kitchen would be clear. She also mentioned that her mother and sister would be there, and they don't really cook, but they'd be happy to help set the table. And then, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, she wrote, also, would you be able to look after the cleanup after dinner? Kyle and I want to be present with our guests and not stuck in the kitchen. I know that's a lot to ask, but you're so capable, Lorraine. I read it twice, then I looked up. Lorraine was watching me. I said, she wants you to cook for 26 people, drive 4.5 hours with a car full of groceries, accommodate dietary restrictions she's told you about. After the fact, have everything done before guests arrive so the kitchen looks clean, and then stay after to wash up. Lorraine said, yes, I said. While her mother and sister set the table, she said, apparently. I said, and Kyle signed off on this. She looked at the table. She said, I don't know. I closed the laptop. I said, I'm going to call Kyle. She put her hand on my arm. She said, James, don't. I said, Lorraine. She said, let me think. I let her think. I made tea and I sat with her and I didn't say anything because she'd asked me not to and because I knew something was happening that needed to happen in her own time. She was quiet for a long while. She picked up her mug and put it down without drinking from it. Then she said, I don't want to go. I looked at her. She said it again more quietly. I don't want to go. I don't want to drive 4.5 hours with a car full of groceries and cook for 26 people and clean up a kitchen while Tessa's mother watches. I don't want to do that. She said it like she was testing the words, like she'd never said them out loud before and wasn't sure they were allowed. I said, okay. She said, is that terrible? I said, no. She said, Kyle. I said, Kyle is a grown man. Kyle will be fine. She looked at me for a long time, and then something shifted in her face. Just slightly, just around the eyes, and she said, what are we going to do instead? And I said, whatever you want. Now, I need to tell you about a phone call I'd gotten in September that I hadn't mentioned to Lorraine yet. Not because I was hiding it, but because the timing hadn't felt right, and then it did. My old friend Pete and his wife Sandra had moved to Prince Edward Island 3 years ago, to a farmhouse outside Charlottetown that they'd been restoring since before the pandemic. We'd been friends with them since our 20s. Pete and I used to play hockey together in Sudbury, and Sandra and Lorraine had been close for years. When they'd moved, Lorraine had cried a little in the car on the way home from their going-away party, though she'd never admit that. Pete had called in September to say they were finally, done with the main floor of the house, and that Thanksgiving weekend was when they were going to do their first proper dinner in the new kitchen, and did we want to come? I'd said I'd check. And then Tessa's first email had arrived, and I'd set it aside, and the weeks had moved fast. But sitting at that kitchen table, watching Lorraine say for the first time out loud that she didn't want to go, I thought about Pete's call, and I made a decision. I said, what if we went to PEI? She blinked. What? I told her about Pete's call, about Sandra, about the new kitchen. She stared at me. She said, you never told me about that. I said, the timing wasn't right. It is now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we can't just, Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks. I said, I know. She said, the flights. I said, let me check. I pulled out my phone. Air Canada had seats on the Thursday morning flight out of Sudbury Regional to Halifax, connecting to Charlottetown, not cheap. I didn't care, I said. There are seats. She looked at me like she was waiting for the part where I said I was joking. I said, we haven't seen Pete and Sandra in 2 years. You've wanted to see that house since they started posting pictures. And you don't want to go to Toronto. She said very quietly, what about Kyle? I said, Kyle is 31 years old. His wife planned a dinner for 26 people in a condo kitchen. That's between them and whoever they choose to call. She sat with that. Then she said, okay. I booked the flights that night. 2 return tickets, Thursday to Sunday. I texted Pete, and he called back within 4 minutes, which is the fastest Pete has ever done anything in his life. I didn't tell Lorraine about the call with Pete. I just said it was handled, and she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in a while. Now we had to figure out how to tell Tessa. Lorraine wanted to call. I said we should write, so there was something clear. She agreed. We sat together, and she drafted a message while I read over her shoulder. It was polite. It said that after thinking it over, we wouldn't be able to make it to Toronto for Thanksgiving this year. That we hoped the dinner went beautifully, and that we'd love to see them at Christmas. No explanation. No apology. No, I hope this doesn't cause too much trouble. She read it back to herself. She said, is it too short? I said no is a complete sentence. This is a paragraph. It's generous. She laughed. Actually laughed, a small one, but real. She hit send. Then we waited. Tessa's reply came 4 hours later. It was not short. She said she was honestly a little shocked. She said she had been counting on Lorraine to handle the cooking. She said rearranging at this stage would be incredibly stressful. She said she didn't understand why Lorraine couldn't have said something sooner. She said, and this is the part I had to read twice, that she thought Lorraine was being a bit selfish given how important this dinner is to us. Lorraine read it standing at the kitchen counter. She didn't say anything. She put the phone face down and went to fold laundry. I picked up the phone and read it myself. Then I did something Lorraine had asked me not to do. I called Kyle. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I said, have you seen the message your wife sent your mother? He was quiet for a moment. He said, she told me you guys weren't coming. I said, have you seen what she wrote when your mother told her we weren't coming? Another pause. He said, I'll talk to her. I said, Kyle, your mother was asked to cook for 26 people, drive 9 hours round trip, accommodate dietary restrictions that were added after the fact, and stay to clean up so Tessa could enjoy her party. Your mother said no. That's not selfish. That's a person saying they have a limit. He was quiet. I said, I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling because you're my son and I think you already know what I'm saying is true. He said, I know, Dad. I said, okay, we'll see you at Christmas. I hung up. Lorraine was standing in the doorway. She said, I asked you not to call him. I said, I know. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, what did he say? I said, that he knew. She nodded slowly. Then she went back to the laundry. The week before Thanksgiving, I drove to the grocery store and came back with smoked salmon, a good bottle of Okanagan Red, a box of those thin crackers Lorraine likes, and a card for Pete and Sandra. Lorraine raised an eyebrow when I came in. I said, for the plane. She shook her head and smiled. We left on a Thursday morning in October. Sudbury was gray and cool, the kind of gray that's been settled in since late September and won't lift until May. We drove to the airport in the dark. Lorraine had a travel mug of coffee and wore the green scarf she bought in Halifax 8 years ago, that she only takes out when she's going somewhere that matters. On the plane, somewhere over Quebec, she fell asleep with her head against the window. I sat there and watched the clouds and thought about what the afternoon was going to look like. Pete's kitchen that we'd only seen in pictures. Sandra's bread she'd been threatening to bake us for 3 years. The PEI light in October that everyone says is different from everywhere else. We landed in Charlottetown just before noon. Pete was at the arrival's door in a flannel jacket and work boots, looking more like himself than he had in years. Sandra was beside him, and she grabbed Lorraine before Lorraine even had her bag off her shoulder. The farmhouse was everything we'd been shown in photos and then some. Pine floors, high ceilings, a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out onto a field that backed up to old growth. Sandra had the oven going already. Pete had found a bottle of something he'd been saving. We ate at a long table by the window. Turkey that Pete had picked up from a farm 10 minutes down the road. Roasted vegetables. A squash dish Sandra had been experimenting with all fall. Bread that had been rising since the morning. Pie from a place in town that Sandra had decided was too good to compete with. Nobody was counting dishes. Nobody was managing a list. We sat there for 4 hours and nobody looked at a phone. Thanksgiving dinner. For 4 people. It was the best one I'd had in years. My phone rang at 6:15. I was in Pete's living room, next to the wood stove, half watching a hockey game with a glass in my hand. Lorraine was in the kitchen with Sandra, doing the dishes, voluntarily, laughing about something I couldn't hear. I looked at the screen. It was Kyle. I let it ring. He called back 2 minutes later. I let it ring again. Lorraine came to the doorway. She'd heard it. She looked at me and I looked at her and she nodded once and went back to the kitchen. He didn't leave a voicemail. He texted instead. It said, "Hope you guys are doing okay. Let's talk soon." That was it. I put the phone in my pocket. Pete looked over from his chair. He said, "Everything all right?" I said, "Yeah, everything's fine." He nodded and turned back to the game. The fire was going. The house smelled like wood smoke and leftover pie. Through the doorway, I could hear Lorraine laughing at something Sandra said. A full laugh this time. Unguarded. The one that fills a room. I'm not going to tell you everything got fixed. I'm not going to tell you Kyle apologized the way he should have, or that Tessa came around and understood what she'd asked. I'm going to tell you what I know. I know that Lorraine slept 8 hours that night in a farmhouse in PEI with the window cracked and the October air coming in cold and clean. I know that she woke up Saturday morning and made coffee with Pete's old mocha pot on the wood stove and stood at the kitchen window watching the field in the early light, and that she looked the way she used to look before all of it, before the slow accumulation of small things being handed to her until they weren't small anymore. I know that on Sunday, before we got in the car for the airport, she stood in Pete and Sandra's driveway and hugged Sandra for a long time and said, "I needed this. I really needed this." And Sandra said, "I know. Come back in spring." And I know that on the plane home, somewhere over New Brunswick, Lorraine took my hand and held it and said thank you. She didn't say for what. She didn't have to. Christmas was quieter than usual. Kyle came up to Sudbury with Tessa, and we made dinner here, the 4 of us, and it was fine. Tessa was polite. Kyle helped set the table. We talked about their plans and ours, and nobody mentioned Thanksgiving. Before they left, Kyle walked me out to the garage while Lorraine and Tessa were saying goodbye at the door. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I should have said something sooner, about what she asked Mom to do." "I'm sorry, Dad," I said. "Tell your mother," he said. "I will." I don't know if he did. Lorraine hasn't said. But I know that the following September, when Tessa sent a message about Thanksgiving, the message said, "We're thinking of ordering from a catering company this year and just having you guys for the weekend. No cooking, just time together. Would that work?" Lorraine read it to me at the kitchen table. Then she looked up and smiled. She said, "I think that would work."